The closure of three mid-sized U.S. banks since March and the takeover of Swiss giant Credit Suisse by rival UBS is contributing to growing concerns around the Canadian banking system. However, risk management experts believe the likelihood of a shock that could impair the Canadian financial system has decreased since last year. The Bank of Canada's 2023 Financial System Survey shows that confidence in the resilience of the Canadian financial system is at its highest level since the central bank's first such survey in 2018. But concerns remain around geopolitical tensions, high inflation, unemployment, and household debt burdens. Joining us now to give us his take on the banking sector globally and nationally is Brendan Caldwell, director at Caldwell Securities Ltd. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always great to be here, Nima.
Always great to have you. Now, banks regularly go through stress tests to see if they could handle adverse economic scenarios. However, it seems that rising interest rates are not a factor when it comes to this. So do you think this has been the major problem here, Brendan?
I think you might be referring to the U.S. I'm not actually sure what they do in Canada, but they say generals always prepare for the last war. So I think central banks always prepare for the last crisis. During the last crisis, the big financial crisis of 2008, interest rates on government guaranteed debt went to near zero, where the spreads, the difference between government debt and what everybody else had borrowed at, widened out considerably. And so the big risk that central banks were concerned about was credit risk. What is the risk that the underlying credit, the underlying issuer bonds would actually go bankrupt? And so stress tests very much focused around that. But they didn't think about, well, what happens if interest rates go up? Because surely if interest rates go up, doesn't that mean the economy is doing well and things are great? What could possibly go wrong in that scenario? So yes, as I understand it, the U.S. didn't stress test its banks for what would happen if interest rate risk rather than credit risk became the predominant problem.
And for those who may not be familiar, Brendan, can you walk us through how and why these U.S. bank failures have been occurring in the first place?
Oh, yeah. So again, financial crisis, they had bad investments. That's the technical investment terminology. Stuff was just bad. It was packaged up and perfume sprayed on it so that it would smell good, but it was just bad, bad, bad to the core. And that's 2008. Flash forward to the present, the investments these banks had weren't bad as such. They were genuinely government guaranteed debt. The problem was they were borrowing very short term and investing longer term, which normally works out great because the rates on short term debt, particularly if you're taking in money to checking accounts and savings accounts, which aren't paying very much of anything, normally short term debt doesn't cost the banks very much to take in, and they could make a whole whack of money risk free just by lending it, say, to the US government. The problem is when short-term rates go up, and they went up very, very quickly, and you're left holding long-term debt, you now get your cost of capital, your borrowing short, actually costs more than the price of the bonds, the interest rates you're getting on the bonds that you held long. So this interest rate mismatch really is what sent a lot of these U.S. banks into a tizzy and eventually into receivership and bankruptcy.
Now, in recent news, we know Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, he declared that the banking crisis in the United States is over. So what are your thoughts on this, Brendan? Is it truly over?
Well, that's a relief. If Jamie Dimon says it, it must be true. Now, far be it from the president of a U.S. bank to talk his position. I don't know that we know the full extent of it. Everybody's talking like interest rates have peaked here, like there's going to be no more interest rate hikes, that the central banks have stopped raising rates. I don't particularly think that's true. Now, I don't also particularly think that there's going to be a whole bunch of disasters in a similar way, but I do think interest rates probably will go up from here.
All right, Brendan. Now, as you mentioned earlier, this seems to be a different situation than from the 2008 financial crisis. So should Canadian investors worry about the Canadian banks amid the failures of U.S. ones?
Probably not. I think the president of the TD Bank at the time of the financial crisis more or less said, well, we're just simple Canadian boys. We weren't smart enough to get ourselves into this whole credit risk mess, the mortgage-backed securities and collateralized loan obligations. We just didn't understand them. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but banking regulations in Canada have been much stricter, but also there's far less competition so that the banks don't have to try as hard. They don't have to pay as higher rate to their depositors. They only have to, give $100,000 in guarantees rather than the U.S., which is 250,000 U.S. in depositor guarantees. There's a lot that Canadian banks don't have to do because they don't have to compete very hard relative to the U.S., where there are thousands of banks. So on the one hand, stronger regulation. On the other hand, bigger banks that, because they have more or less an oligopoly, do what's good for the banks, even if it might cost the consumer more.
All right, Brandon, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Nima.
We'll be right back.